In this Atari Archive, we're looking at slot racers, which really has nothing to do with actual slot racing. Most of the Atari VCS games we've looked at so far are ones where you know what you're getting into just from the title. A game named Indy 500 is probably about racing. Space War is most likely going to have you fighting in outer space. Blackjack is going to involve playing cards, and so forth. Then you get to slot racers, and you're probably going to be kind of baffled. What the heck is going on here, you might ask? After all, slot racing in real life is little more than model cars you insert into an electrically connected track and drive around a predetermined route. This game has player vehicles driving around a maze shooting at each other. So I guess if you have the Sears version of the game, which was released under the title Maze, you might have a better idea of what you're getting into here. But what if I told you the reason slot racers seem so far removed from the source material is because that wasn't the premise in the first place? But before we get into that, we have to step back a moment and recognize that Slot Racers is the first Atari VCS game developed by Warren Robinett. Best known for his third and final VCS game, Adventure, Robinett was part of the second hiring wave of Atari home video game programmers, coming on board in November 1977, shortly after other notable Atari developers like David Crane and Jim Huther joined the company. According to Robinett, the best way to figure out how to program a game for the VCS within its limitations is to just start writing a complete one, and while driving to work one day, he had an idea in his head for a game he called Traffic. In it, two cars would be driving around a city maze, firing rockets at each other in what I assume is a severe case of road rage. With that concept in mind, Robinett looked to combat for inspiration on how the game could control. He liked the idea of the player having to orient themselves to the direction of their vehicle, with left and right on the joystick turning them left and right from whatever direction they were already facing. On the flip side, he didn't like how the game reacted when a tank drove into a wall. For his traffic game, Robinett decided he wanted to ensure that the vehicles could smoothly move around corners, which would ultimately set it apart from the tank game on Combat. From there, the design was iterative. He came up with different mazes, adjusted the speed and momentum of the vehicles, and ultimately produced a pretty unique game for the platform, albeit one that he looks himself back on as being rather average. And finally, for reasons unknown to him, Atari's marketing department changed the name from Traffic to Slot Racers, even though in their own marketing materials, they basically described the game as Robinett had envisioned it. Much as Robinett planned, Slot Racers has two players driving cars around one of four mazes. Hit your opponent with a rocket, and you get a point, sending them flying in the process. The first player to get 25 points wins the game. You can turn the car left and right at intersections, and both speed up and slow down your car by pushing up or down on the joystick. The difficulty switches will either let you fire a new missile at any time, erasing the current one on screen, or will force you to wait for your missile to either hit your opponent or get picked up by the player before letting you fire again. In a twist, in all but two game types, players can also control the missiles to some extent by pushing a direction while firing. Holding left or right while firing a missile will cause it to go in that direction, while holding none will cause it to drift forward and turn at every corner it comes to. In addition to changing the maze, higher numbered game types will also cause the cars to move faster. Game types 1 through 4 also speed the missiles up with each increasing number, while game types 5 through 7 give you cars that move faster than the missiles. Finally, game types 8 and 9 feature missiles that are unable to take corners, along with a choice between slower cars and fast ones. Unfortunately, Robinett was unable to include one final gameplay item from his original premise within the 2K of cartridge ROM space available to him. He wanted police cars with blinking lights to also be cruising the maze, chasing the players. But even without that additional aspect, it's a pretty decent little game. It may not be a VCS classic, but it's worth putting on and playing a few rounds with some friends. Game Type 1 moves awfully slow and is really only good for getting the hang of how the game plays before moving on to the more complex mazes and faster speeds. These are where Slot Racers shines. Contemporary press agreed with this assertion as well. In the June 1981 Arcade Alley column in Video Magazine, authors Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz note the title has nothing to do with the game, but nevertheless considers it to be one of the most important of the classic maze games. They considered it to be quite a thrilling game, requiring quick thinking and fast reflexes, and recognize that while it takes some practice to get the hang of steering, it's well worth it. Like almost all of the Atari 1978 VCS releases, there's no clear indication of when Slot Racers hit store shelves. Atari's copyright for the game, indicating when they expected it to begin being sold, is in July, though this seems awfully early since Robinett remembers turning in the final code for production in April after 5 months of development time. It could take a few months from the code being finalized and sent to production before finished cartridges would be rolling off the assembly lines and headed to stores. So while July is plausible, it's a tight timeline. The game was for sure available nationally by the Christmas shopping season, but in the absence of better information, I'm sticking with July. And like several of the games we've looked at so far, Slot Racers did sell a few copies into the later days of the VCS's life, in addition to appearing in some of the final Warner-era Atari catalogs in 1983. A whopping 48 copies were sold in 1987 by Atari Corp., with another 77 copies the following year. Late 80s sales aren't really the legacy of Slot Racers, though. It's an early example of a well-done maze game years before Pac-Man made it the dominant genre, and a nifty two-player game in its own right. But its legacy goes beyond Slot Racers itself. This game was the first step on the road Robinett took towards developing adventure, and the wall interaction routines he created for this game found their way into that influential title. So while Slot Racers may be little more than a roadside motel on the way to that destination, at least it's a pretty nice one. Next time, it's the first game from another celebrated VCS developer.